off, forming up, and a count off again. The temperature was 32 degrees below 0 centigrade. The prisoners' transport train had come from the Donbass, and all the prisoners had been arrested back in the summer, and were wearing low shoes, Oxfords, even sandals. They tried to warm themselves at the fires, but the guards chased them away. That's not what the fires were there for. They were there to give light. Fingers grew numb almost instantly. The snow filled the thin shoes and didn't even melt. There was no mercy, and the order was given, "Fall in, form up, one step to the right or left, and we'll fire without warning. Forward march." The dogs on their chains howled at their favorite command, at the excitement of the moment. The convoy guards marched ahead in their sheepskin coats, and the doomed prisoners in their summer clothes marched through deep snow on a totally untraveled road, somewhere into the dark taiga, nary a light ahead. The northern lights gleamed. For them it was their first, and probably their last view of them. The fir trees crackled in the frost. The ill-shod prisoners paced and trod down the snow, their feet and legs growing numb from the cold. Or, as another example, here is a January, 1945, arrival at Pechora. "Our armies have captured Warsaw. Our armies have cut off East Prussia." An empty, snowy field. The prisoners were tossed out of the cars, made to sit down in the snow by sixes, painstakingly counted off, miscounted, and counted again. They were ordered to stand up, and then were harried through a snowy virgin waste for 4 miles. This prisoner transport was also from the south, from Moldavia, and everyone was wearing leather shoes. The police dogs were right on their heels, and the dogs pushed the Zeks in the last row with their paws on their backs, breathing on the backs of their heads. 2 priests were in that row, old grey-haired Father Fyodor Floria and young Father Viktor Shipovalnikov, who was helping to hold him up. What a use for police dogs! No, what self-restraint it showed on the dogs' part. After all, they wanted to bite so badly. Finally they arrived. There was a camp reception bath. They had to undress in one cabin, run across the yard naked, and wash in another. But all this was bearable now. The worst was over. They had arrived. Twilight fell, and all of a sudden it was learned that there was no room for them. The camp wasn't ready to receive the prisoner transport, and after the bath the prisoners were again formed up, counted, surrounded by dogs, and were marched back to their prisoner transport train, all those 4 miles, but this time in the dark. And the car doors had been left open all those hours, and had lost even their earlier pitiful measure of warmth, and then all the coal had been burned up by the end of the journey, and there was nowhere to get any more now. And in these circumstances they froze all night, and in the morning were given dried carp, and anyone who wanted to drink could shoe snow, and then marched back along the same road again. And this, after all, was an episode with a happy ending. In this case the camp at least existed. If it couldn't accept them today, it would tomorrow. But it was not at all unusual for the red trains to arrive nowhere, and the end of the journey often marked the opening day of a new camp. They might simply stop somewhere in the taiga under the northern lights and nail to a fir tree a sign reading, "First Olp," OLP, separate campsite. And there they would chew on dried fish for a week and try to mix their flour with snow. But if a camp had been set up there even 2 weeks earlier, that already spelled comfort. Hot food would have been cooked. And even if there were no bowls, the first and second courses would nonetheless be mixed together in wash basins for 6 prisoners to eat from at the same time. And this group of 6 would form a circle. There were no tables or chairs yet, and 2 of them would hold on to the handles of the wash basin with their left hands, and would eat with their right hands, taking turns. Am I repeating myself? No, this was Perebory in 1937, as reported by Loshchilin. It is not I who am repeating myself, but Gulag. Next, they would assign the newcomers' brigade leaders from among the camp veterans, who would quickly teach them to live, to make do, to submit to discipline, and to cheat. And from their very first morning they would march off to work because the chimes of the clock of the great epoch were striking and could not wait. The Soviet Union is not, after all, some Tsarist hard-labor Akatui for you, where prisoners got 3 days' rest after they arrived. Gradually the economy of the archipelago prospered. New railroad branch lines were built, and soon they were transporting prisoners by train to many places that had been reached only by water not long before. But there are natives of the archipelago still alive who can tell you how they went down the Ishmael River in genuine ancient Russian river galleys, 100 to a boat, and the prisoners themselves did the rowing. They can tell you how they traveled in fishing smacks down the northern rivers of Ukhta, Usa, and Pechora to their native camp. Zeks were shipped to Vorkuta in barges, on large barges to Adzvavom, where there was a trans-shipping point for Vorkutlag, and from there only a stone's throw, let's say, to Ust-Usa, on a flat-bottomed barge for 10 days. The whole barge was alive with lice, and the convoy allowed the prisoners to go up on deck one by one and brush the parasites off into the water. The river transports did not proceed directly to their destination either, but were sometimes interrupted to transfer for transshipment, or for portage, or for stretches covered on foot. And they had their own transit prisons in this area, built out of poles or tents, Ust-Usa, Pomozdino, Shchelia-Yur, where they had their own special system of regulations. They had their own convoy rules, and of course their own special commands, and their own special convoy tricks, and their own special methods of tormenting the Zeks. But it's already clear that it is not our task to describe those particular exotica, so we won't even begin. The northern Dvina, the Ob, and the Yenisei know when they began to haul prisoners in barges during the liquidation of the kulaks. These rivers flowed straight north, and their barges were pot-bellied and capacious, and it was the only way they could cope with the task of carting all this grey mass from living Russia to the dead north. People were thrown into the trough-like holds and lay there in piles or crawled around like crabs in a basket. And high up on the deck, as though atop a cliff, stood guards. Sometimes they transported this mass out in the open without any cover, and sometimes they covered it with a big tarpaulin, in order not to look at it, or to guard it better, but certainly not to keep off the rain. The journey in such a barge was no longer prisoner transport, but simply death on the installment plan. Anyway, they gave them hardly anything to eat, then they tossed them out in the tundra, and there they didn't give them anything at all to eat. They just left them there to die, alone with nature. Prisoner transport by barge on the northern Dvina and on the Vichegda had not died out even by 1940. That was how A.Y. Olenev was transported. Prisoners in the hold stood tightly jammed against each other, and not just for a day either. They urinated in glass jars which were passed from hand to hand and emptied through the porthole, and anything more substantial went right in their pants. Barge transport on the Yenisei came to be a regular and permanent feature for whole decades. In Krasnoyarsk in the 30s, open-sided sheds were built on the bank, and in the cold Siberian winters the prisoners would shiver there for a day or two while they waited for transportation. And V.I. Lenin in 1897 boarded the St. Nicholas in the passenger port like a free person. The Yenisei prisoner transport barges were permanently equipped with dark holds 3 decks deep. The only light was what filtered in through the companionway for the ship's ladder. The convoy lived in a little cabin on deck. Sentries kept watch over the exits from the hold and over the river to make sure that no one escaped by swimming. They didn't go down into the hold, no matter what groans and howls for help might come from there, and the prisoners were never taken up on deck for fresh air. In the prisoner transports of 1937 and 1938, and 1944 and 1945, and we can guess it must have been the same in the interval, no medical assistance whatever was provided in the hold. The prisoners lay there lined up in 2 rows, one with their heads toward the side of the barge, and the heads of the other row at their feet. The only way to get to the latrine barrels was to walk over them. The latrine barrels were not always emptied in time. Imagine lugging that barrel full of sewage up the steep ship's ladder to the deck. They overflowed, and the contents spilled along the deck and seeped down on those below. And people lay there. They were fed gruel from casks hauled along the deck. The servers were prisoners too, and there in the eternal darkness, today perhaps there is electricity, by the light of a portable bat kerosene lamp, they ladled out the food. Such a prisoner transport to Dudinka sometimes took a month. Nowadays, of course, they can do it in a week. It sometimes happened that the trip dragged out much longer because of sandbars and other hazards of river travel, and they wouldn't have enough food with them, in which case they just stopped giving out the food for several days at a time. And later on, of course, they never made up for the days they missed. At this point, the alert reader can, without the author's help, add that the thieves were on the upper level inside the hold and closer to the ship's ladder. In other words, to light and air. They had what access they required to the distribution of the bread ration, and if the trip in question was a hard one, they didn't hesitate to whip away the holy crutch. In other words, they took the grey cattle's rations from them. The thieves whiled away the long journey playing cards, and they made their own decks. V. Shalamov tells about this in detail in his Sketches of the Criminal World. They got the stakes for their card games by frisking the suckers, searching everyone lying in a particular section of the barge. For a certain length of time they won and re-won and re-lost their loot, and then it floated up to the convoy. Yes, the reader has now guessed everything. The thieves had the convoy on the hook. The convoy either kept the stolen things for themselves or sold them at the wharves and brought the thieves something to eat in exchange. And what about resistance? It happened, but only rarely. One case has been preserved. In 1950, on such a barge as I have described, except that it was larger, a sea-going barge en route from Vladivostok to Sakhalin, 7 unarmed 58s resisted the thieves, in this case bitches, who numbered about 80 in all, some with knives as usual. These bitches had searched the whole transport back at Vladivostok Transit Point 310, and they had searched it very thoroughly, in no way less efficiently than the jailers. They knew all the hiding places, but no search can ever turn up everything. Aware of this, when they were already in the hold, they treacherously announced, "Whoever has money can buy Makhorka." And Misha Grachev got out 3 rubles he had hidden in his quilted jacket, and the bitch Volodka Tatarin shouted at him, "You crowbait, why don't you pay your taxes?" And he rushed in to take it away. But Master Sergeant Pavel, whose last name has not been recorded, pushed him away. Volodka Tatarin aimed a slingshot, a V fork, at Pavel's eyes, and Pavel knocked him off his feet. Immediately 20 to 30 bitches moved in on him, and around Grachev and Pavel gathered Volodya Shpakov, a former army captain, Serezha Potapov, Volodya Reunov, a former army sergeant, Volodya Tretyukin, another former sergeant, and Vasar Kravatskov. And what happened? The whole thing ended after only a few blows had been exchanged. This may have been a matter of the age-old and very real cowardice of the thieves, always concealed behind feigned toughness and devil-may-care insolence, or else the proximity of the guard held them back, this being right beneath the hatchway. Or it may have been that on this trip they were saving themselves for a more important social task, to seize control of the Alexandrovsk transit prison, the one Chekhov described, and a Sakhalin construction project, seizing control of it, of course, not in order to construct, before the honest thieves could. At any rate, they pulled back, restricting themselves to the threat, "On dry land we'll make garbage out of you." The battle never took place, and no one made garbage out of the boys, and at the Alexandrovsk transit point, the bitches met with misfortune. It was already firmly held by the honest thieves. In steamships to the Kolyma, everything was the same as on the barges, except that everything was on a larger scale. Strange as it seems, some of the prisoners sent to the Kolyma in several overage old tubs on the famous expedition led by the icebreaker Krasin in the spring of 1938 are still alive today. On the steamers Druma, Kulu, Nevostroy, Dneprostroy, for which the Krasin was breaking the way through the spring ice, there were also 3 decks in the cold, dirty holds, and on these decks, in addition, there were 2-story bunks made out of poles. This book is continued at this point, on the other side of this cassette. The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 1, Section 2,
Continued.
Cassette 9, Side 2. On the steamers Druma, Kulu, Nevostroy, Dneprostroy, for which the Krasin was breaking the way through the spring ice, there were also 3 decks in the cold, dirty holds, and on these decks, in addition, there were 2-story bunks made out of poles. It was not completely dark. There were some kerosene lanterns and lamps. The prisoners were allowed up on deck in batches for fresh air and walks. 3,000 to 4,000 prisoners were in each steamer. The voyage took more than a week, and before it was over, all the bread brought aboard in Vladivostok got mouldy, and the ration was reduced from 21 to 14 ounces a day. They also gave out fish, and as for drinking water, well, there's no reason to gloat here, because there were temporary difficulties with the water. Here, in contrast to the river transports, there were heavy seas, storms, seasickness. The exhausted, enfeebled people vomited and didn't have the strength to get up out of their vomit, and all the floors were covered with a nauseating mess. There was one political incident on the voyage. The steamers had to pass through La Pérouse Strait, very close to the Japanese islands. And at that point, the machine guns disappeared from the watchtowers, and the convoy guards changed to civilian clothes. The hatches were battened down, and access to the decks was forbidden. According to the ship's papers, foresightedly prepared back in Vladivostok, they were transporting, God save us, not prisoners, but volunteers for work in the Kolyma. A multitude of Japanese small craft and boats hovered about the ships without suspecting. And on another occasion in 1938, there was an incident involving the Druma. The thieves aboard got out of the hold and into the storage room, plundered it, and set it afire. The ship was very close to Japan when this occurred. Smoke was pouring from it, and the Japanese offered help, but the captain refused to accept it, and even refused to open the hatches. When Japan had been left behind, the corpses of those suffocated by smoke were thrown overboard, and the half-burned, half-spoiled food aboard was sent on to camp as rations for the prisoners. Decades have passed since then, but how many times Soviet citizens have met with misfortune on the world's oceans, and in circumstances where it seems that zeks were not being transported. Yet, because of that same secretiveness disguised as national pride, they have refused help. Let the sharks devour us, so long as we don't have to accept your helping hand. Secretiveness, that is our cancer. Short of Magadan, the ship caravan got caught in the ice, and not even the Krasin could help. It was too early for navigation, but they had been in a hurry to deliver laborers. On May the 2nd, they disembarked the prisoners on the ice some distance from the shore. The newly arrived prisoners got a look at the cheerless panorama of the Magadan of that time. Dead hillocks, neither trees, nor bushes, nor birds, just a few wooden houses and the 2-story building of Dalstroy. Nonetheless, continuing to play out the farce of correction, in other words, pretending they had brought not simply bones with which to pave the gold-bearing Kolyma, but temporarily isolated Soviet citizens who would yet return to creative life, they were greeted by the Dalstroy Orchestra. The orchestra played marches and waltzes, and the tormented, half-dead people strung along the ice in a grey line, dragging their Moscow belongings with them, and this enormous prisoner transport consisted almost entirely of politicals who had hardly encountered a single thief yet, and carrying on their shoulders other half-dead people, arthritis sufferers, or prisoners without legs. And the legless, too, got prison terms. But here I note that I am again beginning to repeat myself, and this will be boring to write and boring to read, because the reader already knows everything that is going to happen ahead of time. The prisoners would be trucked hundreds of miles and driven dozens of miles more on foot, and on arriving they would occupy new campsites and immediately be sent out to work, and they would eat fish and flour chased down with snow, and sleep in tents. Yes, it was like that. But first the authorities would put them up in Magadan, also in Arctic tents, and would commission them there too. In other words, examine them naked to determine their fitness for labor from the condition of their buttocks, and all of them would turn out to be fit. In addition, of course, they would be taken to a bath, and in the bath vestibule they would be ordered to leave their leather coats their Romanoff sheepskin coats, their woolen sweaters, their suits of fine wool, their felt cloaks, their leather boots, their felt boots. For, after all, these were no illiterate peasants this time, but the party elite, editors of newspapers, directors of trusts and factories, responsible officials in the provincial party committees, professors of political economy, and, by the beginning of the 30s, all of them understood what good merchandise was. "And who is going to guard them?" the newcomers asked skeptically. "Oh, come on now, who needs your things?" The bath personnel acted offended. "Go on in and don't worry." And they did go in. And the exit was through a different door, and after passing through it they received black cotton breeches, field shirts, camp-quilted jackets without pockets, and pigskin shoes. Oh, this was no small thing. This was farewell to your former life, to your titles, your positions, and your arrogance. "Where are our things?" they cried. "Your things you left at home," some chief or other bellowed at them. "In camp, nothing belongs to you. Here in camp we have communism. Forward march, leader." And if it was communism, then what was there for them to object to? That is what they had dedicated their lives to. And there are also prisoner transports in carts and simply on foot. Do you remember in Tolstoy's Resurrection how on a sunny day they drove them on foot from the prison to the railroad station? Well, in Minusinsk in 1940-something, after the prisoners hadn't been taken into the fresh air for a whole year, they had forgotten how to walk, to breathe, to look at the light. And then they took them out, put them in formation, and drove them the 15 miles to Abakan on foot. About a dozen of them died along the way, and no one is ever going to write a great novel about it, not even one chapter. If you live in a graveyard, you can't weep for everyone. A prisoner transport on foot. That was the grandfather of prisoner transport by rail, of the Stolypin car, and of the red cattle cars, too. In our time, it is used less and less, and only where mechanical transportation is still impossible. Thus, in one sector of Lake Ladoga, the prisoners were sent on foot from besieged Leningrad to the red cars, nicknamed Red Cows. They led the women, together with the German POWs, and used bayonets to keep our men away from them so they couldn't take their bread. Those who fell by the wayside were immediately tossed up into a truck, alive or dead, after their shoes were removed. And in the 30s, each day they sent off on foot from the Kotlas transit prison to Ust-Vim, about 185 miles, and sometimes to Chibiu, more than 300 miles, a transport of 100 prisoners. Once, in 1938, they sent off a women's prisoner transport the same way. These transports covered 15 miles a day. The convoy marched along with 1 or 2 dogs, and those who fell behind were urged on with gun stocks. True, the prisoners' possessions, as well as the cooking pot and the food, brought up the rear in carts, and this transport thus recalled the classic prisoner transports of the past century. There were also prisoner transport huts, the ruined houses of liquidated kulaks, with windows broken and doors ripped off. The accounting office of the Kotlas transit prison had issued provisions to the transport based on a theoretical estimate of the time the journey would take, provided nothing went wrong on the way, without allowing for even 1 extra day, the basic principle of all our accounting. Whenever delays occurred en route, they had to stretch out the provisions and fed the prisoners a mash of rye flour without salt, and sometimes nothing at all. In this respect, they departed from the classic model. In 1940, Olenyev's prison transport, after disembarking from the barge, was herded on foot through the taiga from Kniazh Pogost to Chibiu without anything to eat at all. They drank swamp water and very quickly got dysentery. Some fell by the wayside out of weakness, and the dogs tore the clothes off those who had fallen. In Izhma, they caught fish by using their trousers as nets, and ate them alive. And in a certain meadow they were told, "Right here is where you are going to build a railroad from Kotlas to Vorkuta." And in other areas of our European north, Prisoner transports on foot were standard until the time when, on those same routes and roadbeds built by those earlier Zeks, the jolly red cattle cars rolled along carrying later prisoners. A particular technique for prisoner transports on foot was worked out where such transports were frequent and abundant. When a transport is being taken through the taiga from Kniazh Pogost to Vezliana, and suddenly some prisoner falls by the wayside and can go no farther, what is to be done with him? Just be reasonable and think about it. What? You aren't going to stop the whole transport, and you aren't going to leave one soldier behind for everyone who falls. There are many prisoners and only a few soldiers, and what does that mean? The soldier stays behind for a little while with the fallen prisoner, and then hurries on to catch up with the rest. Alone. Regular transports on foot from Karabas to Spassk were retained for a long time. It was only 20 to 25 miles, but it had to be covered in one day, with 1,000 prisoners in each transport, many of them very weak. It was expected in cases like these that many would simply either drop in their tracks or else fall behind through the indifference and apathy of dying men. You may shoot at them, but they still can't go on. They are not afraid of death, but what about clubs, the indefatigable beating of the clubs wherever they hit? They are afraid of clubs, and they will keep going. This is a tested method. That's how it works. And so, in these cases, the transport column is surrounded not only by the ordinary chain of machine gunners at a distance of 50 yards, but also by an inner chain of soldiers armed only with clubs. Those who have fallen behind get beaten, as, in fact, Comrade Stalin prophesied. They are beaten again and again, and even when they have no strength at all with which to go farther, they keep going, and many do miraculously get to the destination. They don't know that this is a testing by clubs, and that those who lie down and stay lying down and don't go on despite the clubs are picked up by carts following behind. That's organizational experience for you. And one can ask, why then didn't they take them all on carts in the first place? But where could enough carts be found? And horses? After all, we have tractors. What about the price of oats nowadays? Such transports as these were still common in 1948 to 1950. And in the 20s, transport on foot was one of the basic methods. I was a small boy, but I remember very well how they drove them down the streets of Rostov-on-the-Don without any qualms. And the famous order, "We'll open fire without warning," had a different ring at that time, again, because of a difference in technology. After all, the convoy often had only sabers. They used to deliver orders like this: "One step out of line and the convoy guard will shoot and slash." That had a very powerful sound, shoot and slash. You could imagine them cutting off your head from behind. Yes, and even in February 1936, they drove on foot through Nizhny Novgorod a transport of long-bearded old men from the other side of the Volga, in their homespun coats and in real lapti, bast sandals, wrapped around with onuchi, Russian peasant footcloths, old Russia disappearing. And all of a sudden, right across their path, came 3 automobiles, in one of which rode the chairman of the Central Executive Committee, President of the Soviet Union, this is to say, Kalinin. The prisoner transport halted. Kalinin went on through. He wasn't interested. Shut your eyes, reader. Do you hear the thundering of wheels? Those are the Stolypin cars rolling on and on. Those are the red cows rolling every minute of the day and every day of the year. And you can hear the water gurgling. Those are prisoners' barges moving on, and the motors of the Black Marias roar. They are arresting someone all the time, cramming him in somewhere, moving him about. And what is that hum you hear? The overcrowded cells of the transit prisons. And that cry? The complaints of those who have been plundered, raped, beaten to within an inch of their lives. We have reviewed and considered all the methods of delivering prisoners, and we have found that they are all worse. We have examined the transit prisons, but we have not found any that were good. And even the last human hope that there is something better ahead, that it will be better in camp, is a false hope. In camp, it will be worse. Chapter 4. From Island to Island. And Exile also moved from island to island of the archipelago simply in solitary skiffs. This is called special convoy. It is the most unconstrained mode of transport. It can hardly be distinguished from free travel. Only a few prisoners are delivered in this way. I, in my own career as a prisoner, made 3 such journeys. The special convoy is assigned on orders from high officials. It should not be confused with the special requisition, which is also signed by someone high up. A special requisition prisoner usually travels on the general prisoner transports, though he, too, meets up with some amazing interludes on his trip, which are all the more extraordinary in consequence. For example, Hans Bernstein was traveling on a special requisition from the north to the lower Volga to join an agricultural mission. He was exposed to all the overcrowded conditions and humiliations I have described, snarled at by dogs, surrounded by bayonets, threatened with 1 step out of line. And then suddenly he was unloaded at the small station at Zenzevatka and met by one single, calm, unarmed jailer. The jailer yawned. "All right, you'll spend the night at my house and you can go out in the town as you like till morning. Tomorrow I'll take you to the camp." And Hans did go out. Can you understand what going out on the town means to a person whose term is 10 years, who has already said goodbye to life countless times, who was in a Stolypin car that very morning and will be in camp the next day? And he immediately went out to watch the chickens scratching around in the station master's garden, and the peasant women getting ready to leave the station with their unsold butter and melons. He moved 3, 4, 5 steps to the side, and no one shouted, "Halt!" at him. With unbelieving fingers he touched the leaves of the acacias and almost wept. And the special convoy is precisely that sort of miracle from beginning to end. You won't see the common prisoner transports this time. You don't have to keep your hands behind your back. You don't have to undress down to your skin, nor sit on the earth on your rear end, and there won't be any search at all. Your convoy guards approach you in a friendly way, and even address you politely. They warn you, as a general precaution, that in case of any attempt to escape, we do, as usual, shoot. Our pistols are loaded, and we have them in our pockets. However, let's go simply. Act natural. Don't let everyone see that you're a prisoner. And I urge you to note how here, too, as always, the interests of the individual and the interests of the state coincide completely. My camp life was totally transformed the day I went out to line up forlornly in the carpenter's brigade. My fingers cramped, they had gotten stiff holding on to tools and wouldn't straighten out. And the work assignment supervisor took me aside, and with unexpected respect said to me, "Do you know that on orders of the Minister of Internal Affairs—" I was stupefied. The line-up dispersed, and the trustees in the camp compound surrounded me. Some of them said, "They're going to hang a new stretch on you," and others said, "To be released." But everyone agreed on one thing, that there was no escaping Minister of Internal Affairs Kruglov. And I, too, swayed between a new term and being released. I'd quite forgotten that half a year before some character had come to our camp and distributed Gulag registration cards. After the war, they had begun this registration in all the nearby camps, but it seems unlikely that it was ever completed. The most important question on it was trade or profession, and the Zeks would fill in the most precious Gulag trades to enhance their own value: barber, tailor, storekeeper, baker. As for me, I had frowned and filled in nuclear physicist. I had never been a nuclear physicist in my life, and what I knew of the field I had heard in the university before the war. Just a little bit, the names of the atomic particles and their parameters, and I had decided to write down nuclear physicist. This was in 1946. The atom bomb was desperately needed. But I didn't assign any importance to that Gulag registration card, and, in fact, forgot about it. There was a vague, unverified legend, unconfirmed by anybody, that you might nevertheless hear in camp, that somewhere in this archipelago were tiny paradise islands. No one had seen them, no one had been there. Whoever had kept silent about them and never let on. On those islands, they said, flowed rivers of milk and honey, and eggs and sour cream were the least of what they fed you. Things were neat and clean, they said, and it was always warm, and the only work was mental work. And all of it super secret. And so it was that I got to those paradise islands myself. In convict lingo they are called sharashkas, and spent half my sentence on them. It's to them I owe my survival, for I would never have lived out my whole term in the camps. And it's to them I owe the fact that I am writing this investigation, even though I have not allowed them any place in this book. I have already written a novel about them. And it was from one to another of those islands, from the first to the second, and from the second to the third, that I was transported on a special convoy basis. 2 jailers and I. If the souls of those who have died sometimes hover among us, see us, easily read in us our trivial concerns, and we fail to see them or guess at their incorporeal presence, then that is what a special convoy trip is like. You are submerged in the mass of freedom, and you push and shove with the others in the station waiting room. You absent-mindedly examine announcements posted there, even though they can hardly have any relevance for you. You sit on the ancient passenger benches, and you hear strange and insignificant conversations about some husband who beats up his wife or has left her, and some mother-in-law who, for some reason, does not get along with her daughter-in-law. How neighbors in communal apartments make personal use of the electric outlets in the corridor and don't wipe their feet. And how someone is in someone else's way at the office, and how someone has been offered a good job but can't make up his mind to move. How can he move bag and baggage? Is that so easy? You listen to all this, and the goose pimples of rejection run up and down your spine. To you, the true measure of things in the universe is so clear, the measure of all weaknesses and all passions, and these sinners aren't fated to perceive it. The only one there who is alive, truly alive, is incorporeal you, and all these others are simply mistaken in thinking themselves alive. And an unbridgeable chasm divides you. You cannot cry out to them, nor weep over them, nor shake them by the shoulder. After all, you are a disembodied spirit. You are a ghost, and they are material bodies. And how can you bring it home to them? By an inspiration? By a vision? A dream? Brothers, people, why has life been given you? In the deep, deaf stillness of midnight, the doors of the death cells are being swung open, and great-souled people are being dragged out to be shot. On all the railroads of the country this very minute, right now, people who have just been fed salt herring are licking their dry lips with bitter tongues. They dream of the happiness of stretching out one's legs and of the relief one feels after going to the toilet. In Orotukan, the earth thaws only in summer and only to the depth of 3 feet, and only then can they bury the bones of those who died during the winter. And you have the right to arrange your own life under the blue sky and the hot sun, to get a drink of water, to stretch, to travel wherever you like without a convoy. So, what's this about unwiped feet, and what's this about a mother-in-law? What about the main thing in life, all its riddles? If you want, I'll spell it out for you right now. Do not pursue what is illusory, property and position. All that is gained at the expense of your nerves, decade after decade, and is confiscated in one fell night. Live with a steady superiority over life. Don't be afraid of misfortune, and do not yearn after happiness. It is, after all the same. The bitter doesn't last forever, and the sweet never fills the cup to overflowing. It is enough if you don't freeze in the cold, and if thirst and hunger don't claw at your insides, if your back isn't broken, if your feet can walk, if both arms can bend, if both eyes see, and if both ears hear. Then whom should you envy, and why? Our envy of others devours us most of all. Rub your eyes and purify your heart, and prize above all else in the world those who love you and who wish you well. Do not hurt them or scold them, and never part from any of them in anger. After all, you simply do not know. It might be your last act before your arrest, and that will be how you are imprinted in their memory. But the convoy guards stroke the black handles of the pistols in their pockets, and we sit there, 3 in a row, sober fellows, quiet friends. I wipe my brow, I shut my eyes, and then I open them, and once again I see this dream, a crowd of people unaccompanied by guards. I remember clearly that I spent last night in a cell and will be in a cell again tomorrow. But here comes some kind of conductor to punch my ticket. Your ticket? My friend there has it. The cars are full. Well, full in free people's terms. No one is lying under the benches, and no one is sitting on the floor in the aisles. I was told to behave naturally, and I have been behaving very naturally indeed. I noticed a seat beside a window in the next compartment, and got up and took it. And there were no empty seats for my guards in that compartment. They sat where they were and kept their loving eyes on me from there. In Peribori, the seat across the table from me was vacated, but before my guard could get to it and sit down, a moon-faced fellow in a sheepskin coat and a fur cap, with a plain but strong wooden suitcase, sat down there. I recognized his suitcase. It was camp work, made in the archipelago. Phew, he puffs. There was very little light, but I could see he was red in the face and that he had had a hassle to get on the train. And he got out a bottle. How about a beer, comrade? I knew that my guards were close to a nervous breakdown in the next compartment. I was not allowed anything alcoholic. But still, I was supposed to conduct myself as naturally as possible, and so I said carelessly, "All right, why not?" Beer, it's a whole poem. For 3 years I hadn't had even one swallow, and tomorrow in my cell I would brag, "I got beer." The fellow poured it, and I drank it down with a shiver of pleasure. It was already dark. There was no electricity in the car. This was post-war dislocation. One tiny candle end was burning in an ancient lantern at the door, one for 4 compartments, 2 in front and 2 behind. I talked amiably with the fellow, even though we could hardly see each other. No matter how far forward my guard leaned, he couldn't hear a thing because of the clickety-clack of the wheels. In my pocket I had a postcard addressed to my home, and I was about to explain who I was to my simple friend across the table and ask him to drop the card in a mailbox. Judging by his suitcase, he had been in stir himself. But he beat me to it. "You know, I just barely managed to get some leave. They haven't given me any time off for 2 years. It's a dog's branch of the service." "What kind?" "Don't you know? I'm an MVD man, an Asmodeus blue shoulder boards. Haven't you ever seen them?" Hell, why hadn't I guessed right off? Peribori was the center for Volgolag, and he had gotten his suitcase out of the Zeps. They had made it for him for free. How all this had permeated our life. 2 MVD men, 2 Asmodei weren't enough in 2 compartments. There had to be a 3rd, and perhaps there was also a 4th concealed somewhere. And maybe they were in every compartment, and maybe someone else there was traveling by special convoy like me. My fellow kept on whining and complaining of his fate, and at that point I decided to enter a somewhat mystifying demurrer. "And what about the ones you're guarding, the ones who got 10 years for nothing? Is it any easier for them?" He immediately subsided and remained silent until morning. Earlier, in the semi-darkness, he had noticed that I was wearing some kind of semi-military overcoat and field shirt, and he had thought I was simply a soldier boy. But now the devil only knew what I might be. Maybe I was a police agent. Maybe I was out to catch escapees. Why was I in this particular car? And he had criticized the camps there in my presence. By this time the candle end in the lantern was floating, but still burning. On the 3rd baggage shelf some youth was talking in a pleasant voice about the war, the real war, the kind you don't read about in books. He had been with a unit of field engineers and was describing incidents that were true to life. And it was so pleasant to realize that unvarnished truth was, despite everything, pouring into someone's ears. I could have told tales, too. I would even have liked to. But no, I didn't really want to anymore. Like a cow, the war had licked away 4 of my years. I no longer believed that it had all actually happened, that I didn't want to remember it. 2 years here, 2 years in the archipelago had dimmed in my mind all the roads of the front, all the comradeship of the front line, had totally darkened them. One wedge knocks out another. And after spending a few hours among free people, here is what I feel. My lips are mute. There is no place for me among them. My hands are tied here. I want free speech. I want to go back to my native land. I want to go home to the archipelago. In the morning, I deliberately forgot my postcard on an upper shelf. After all, the conductor will get around to cleaning up the car. She will carry it to a mailbox, if she is a human being. We emerge onto the square in front of the northern station in Moscow. Again, my jailers are newcomers to Moscow and don't know the city. We travel on streetcar B, and I make the decisions for them. There is a mob at the streetcar stop in the middle of the square. Everyone is on the way to work at this hour. One jailer climbs up to the streetcar motorman and shows him his MVD identity card. We are allowed to stand imposingly on the front platform for the whole trip, as if we were deputies of the Moscow Soviet, and we don't bother to get tickets. An old man isn't allowed to board there. He isn't an invalid, and he has to board in the rear, like the others. We approach Novoslobodskaya and disembark. And for the first time I see Butyrki prison from the outside, even though it's the 4th time I've been brought there, and I can draw its interior plan without difficulty. Oof! What a grim, high wall stretches for 2 blocks there. The hearts of the Muscovites shiver when they see the steel maw of its gates slide open. But I leave the sidewalks of Moscow behind me without regret, and as I enter that tower of the gatehouse, I feel I am returning home. I smile at the first courtyard and recognize the familiar main doors of carved wood. And it's nothing at all to me that they are now going to make me face the wall, and they already have, and ask me, last name, given name, and patronymic, year of birth. My name? I am the interstellar wanderer. They have tightly bound my body, but my soul is beyond their power. I know, after several hours of inevitable processing of my body, confinement in a box, search, issuing receipts, filling out the admissions card, after the roaster and the bath, I shall be taken to a cell with 2 domes, with a hanging arch in the middle. All the cells are like that, with 2 large windows and a long combination table and cupboard. And I shall be greeted by strangers who are certain to be intelligent, interesting, friendly people, and they will begin to tell me their stories, and I will begin to tell them mine, and by night we will not even feel like going off to sleep right away. And on the bowls will be stamped, so we shouldn't make off with them on the prisoner transport, the mark Butyur, for Butyrskaya Tyurma, Butyrki prison. The Butyur health resort, as we mocked it last time. A health resort, incidentally, very little known to the paunchy bigwigs who want so badly to lose weight. They drag their stomachs to Kislovodsk and go out for long hikes on prescribed trails, do push-ups and sweat for a whole month just to lose 4 to 6 pounds. And there, in the Butyur health resort, right near them, any one of them could lose 17 or 18 pounds just like that in 1 week, without doing any exercises at all. This is a tried and true method. It has never failed. One of the truths you learn in prison is that the world is small, very small indeed. True, the Gulag Archipelago, although it extended across the entire Soviet Union, had many fewer inhabitants than the Soviet Union as a whole. How many there actually were in the archipelago, one cannot know for certain. We can assume that at any one time there were not more than 12 million in the camps, as some departed beneath the sod, the machine kept bringing in replacements. According to the researchers of the Social Democrats Nikolaevsky and Dalin, there were from 15 to 20 million prisoners in the camps. And not more than half of them were politicals. 6 million? Well, that's a small country, Sweden or Greece, and in such countries many people know one another, and quite naturally when you landed in any cell of any transit prison and listened and chatted, you'd be certain to discover you had acquaintances in common with some of your cellmates. And so D, after having spent more than a year in solitary confinement, after Sukhanovka, after Ryumin's beatings and the hospital, could land in a Lubyanka cell and give his name, and then and there a bright chap named F could greet him, "Aha! So now I know who you are." "Where from?" D shied away from him. "You are mistaken." "Certainly not. You are that very same American Alexander D, whom the bourgeois press lied about, saying you had been kidnapped. And Tass denied it. I was free at the time and read about it." I love that moment when a newcomer is admitted to the cell for the first time. Not a novice who has only recently been arrested and will inevitably be depressed and confused, but a veteran Zek. And I myself love to enter a new cell. Nonetheless, God grant I never have to do it again. With an unworried smile and an expansive gesture. "Hi, brothers." I throw my bag on the bunks. "Well, so what's new this past year in Butyrki?" We begin to get acquainted. Some fellow named Suvorov, of 58. At first glance there's nothing remarkable about him, but you probe and pry. At the Krasnoyarsk transit prison, a certain Makhotkin was in his cell. Just a moment, wasn't he an Arctic aviator? Yes, they named an island after him in the Taimyr Gulf, and he's in prison for 5810. So does that mean they let him go to Dudinka? How do you know? Yes. Wonderful. One more link in the biography of a man I don't know. I have never met him, and perhaps I never shall, but my efficient memory has filed away everything I know about him. Makhotkin got a whole quarter, 25 years, but the island named after him couldn't be renamed because it was on all the maps of the world. It wasn't a Gulag island. They had taken him on at the aviation Sharashka in Bolshino, and he was unhappy there, an aviator among engineers and not allowed to fly. They split that Sharashka in two, and Makhotkin got assigned to the Taganrog half, and it seemed as though all connection with him had been severed. In the other half of it, however, in Rybinsk, I was told that he had asked to be allowed to fly in the far north, and now I had just learned he had been given that permission. This was not information I needed, but I had remembered it all, and 10 days later I turned up in the same Butyrki bath box. There are such lovely boxes in the Butyrki with faucets and small wash tubs so as not to tie up the big bath chambers. As a certain R. I didn't know this R either, but it turned out he had been a patient in the Butyrki hospital for half a year and was about to leave for the Rybinsk Sharashka. In another 3 days, the prisoners in Rybinsk, too, a closed block where Zeks are cut off from all ties with the outside world, would nevertheless learn that Makhotkin was in Dudinka, and they would also find out where I had been sent. Now this is the prisoner's telegraph system: attentiveness, memory, chance meetings. And this attractive man in horn-rimmed spectacles? He walked around the cell humming Schubert in a pleasant baritone. And youth again oppresses me, and the way to the grave is long. Tsarapkin, Sergei Romanovich. But look here, I know you very well indeed. You're a biologist, a non-returnee from Berlin. How do you know? But after all, it's a small world. In 1946, with Nikolai Vladimirovich Timofeyev-Rasovsky. Oh, what a cell that had been in 1946. The memories of it returned. It was perhaps the most brilliant cell in all my prison life. It was July. They had taken me from the camp to the Butyrki on those mysterious instructions of the Minister of Internal Affairs. We arrived after lunch, but the prison was so overloaded that the reception processing took 11 hours, and it was not until 3 a.m. that, tired from the boxes, I was admitted to cell 75. Lit by 2 bright electric bulbs below the 2 domes, the whole cell slept side by side, restless because of the stuffiness, The hot July air couldn't circulate through the windows blocked by the muzzles. Sleepless flies kept buzzing, and the sleepers twitched when the flies lit on them. Some of the prisoners had put handkerchiefs over their faces to keep the light out of their eyes. The latrine barrel smelled acrid. Everything decayed more quickly in such heat. 80 people were stuffed into a cell for 25, and this was not the limit either. Prisoners lay tightly packed together on the bunks to left and right, and also on the supplementary planks laid across the aisle. And everywhere feet were sticking out from under the bunks, and the traditional Butyrki table cupboard was pushed back to the latrine barrel. That was where there was still a piece of unoccupied floor, and that was where I lay down. And thus it was that whoever got up to use the latrine barrel before morning had to step across me. When the order, "Get up," was given, shouted through the swill trough in the door, everything started to stir. They began to take up the planks from across the aisles and push the table to the window. Prisoners came up to interview me to find out whether I was a novice or a camp veteran. It turned out that two different waves had met in the cell, the ordinary wave of freshly sentenced prisoners being sent off to camp, and a reverse wave of camp inmates who were all technical specialists, physicists, chemists, mathematicians, design engineers, all being sent to unknown destinations to some sort of thriving scientific research institutes. At this point I relaxed. The minister was not going to hang a new stretch on me. I was approached by a man who was middle-aged, broad-shouldered, yet very skinny, with a slightly aquiline nose. "Professor Timofeyev Rasovsky, president of the Scientific and Technical Society of Cell 75. Our society assembles every day after the morning bread ration next to the left window. Perhaps you could deliver a scientific report to us. What precisely might it be?" Caught unaware, I stood before him in my long, bedraggled overcoat and winter cap. Those arrested in winter are foredoomed to go about in winter clothing during the summer, too. My fingers had not yet straightened out that morning and were all scratched. What kind of scientific report could I give? And right then I remembered that in camp I had recently held in my hands for 2 nights the Smythe Report, the official report of the United States Defense Department on the first atom bomb, which had been brought in from outside. The book had been published that spring. Had anyone in the cell seen it? It was a useless question. Of course, no one had. And thus it was that fate played its joke, compelling me, in spite of everything, to stray into nuclear physics, the same field in which I had registered on the Gulag card. After the rations were issued, the Scientific and Technical Society of Cell 75, consisting of 10 or so people, assembled at the left window, and I made my report and was accepted into the society. I had forgotten some things, and I could not fully comprehend others, and Timofeyev Rasovsky, even though he had been in prison for a year and knew nothing of the atom bomb, was able on occasion to fill in the missing parts of my account. An empty cigarette pack was my blackboard, and I held an illegal fragment of pencil lead. Nikolai Vladimirovich took them away from me and sketched and interrupted, commenting with as much self-assurance as if he had been a physicist from the Los Alamos group itself. He actually had worked with one of the first European cyclotrons, but for the purpose of irradiating fruit flies. He was a biologist, one of the most important geneticists of our time. He had already been in prison back when Zhebrak, not knowing that, or perhaps knowing it, had the courage to write in a Canadian magazine, "Russian biology is not responsible for Lysenko. Russian biology is Timofeyev Rasovsky." And during the destruction of Soviet biology in 1948, Zhebrak paid for this. Schrödinger, in his small book, What is Life?, twice cited Timofeyev Rasovsky, who had long since been imprisoned. And there he was in front of us, and he was simply bursting with information concerning all possible sciences. This book is continued on Cassette 10, Side 1. The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 1, Section 2, concluded. Cassette 10, Side 1. Schrödinger, in his small book, What is Life?, twice cited Timofeyev Rasovsky, who had long since been imprisoned. And there he was in front of us, and he was simply bursting with information concerning all possible sciences. He had that breadth of scope which scientists of later generations don't even want to have. Or is it that the possibilities of encompassing knowledge have changed? And even though at the moment he was so worn down by the starvation of the interrogation period that these exercises were very difficult for him. On his mother's side he was descended from impoverished Kaluga gentlefolk who had lived on the Ressa River, and on his father's side he was a collateral descendant of Stepan Razin, and that Cossack energy was very obvious in him, in his broad frame, in his basic soundness, in his determined struggle with his interrogator, and also in the fact that he suffered from hunger more than we did. And his story was this. In 1922, the German scientist Vogt, who had founded the Brain Institute in Moscow, had asked to have 2 talented graduate students sent abroad to work with him permanently, and that was how Timofeyev Rosovsky and his friend Sarapkin had been sent off on a foreign assignment with no time limit. And even though they did not have any ideological guidance there, they nonetheless achieved great things in science. And when in 1937 they were instructed to return to their homeland, this seemed to them, since it meant interrupting their work, impossible. They could not abandon either the logical continuation of their own researches or their apparatus or their students. And no doubt they also couldn't do it because back in the motherland they would have been compelled to pour shit publicly all over their 15 years of work in Germany. And only that would have earned them the right to go on existing. And would it have earned it for them? And so they became non-returnees, remaining patriots nevertheless. In 1945, the Soviet armies entered Buch, a northeastern suburb of Berlin, and Timofeyev Rosovsky and his entire institute joyously welcomed them. Everything had worked out in the best possible way, and now he would not have to be separated from his institute. Soviet representatives came to inspect it and said, put everything in packing cases and we'll take it all to Moscow. That's impossible, Timofeyev objected. Everything will die on the way. The installations have taken years to set up. The bigwigs acted astonished, and very shortly after that, Timofeyev and Sarapkin were arrested and taken off to Moscow. They were naive. They had thought that the Institute would not be able to operate without them. Well, even if it didn't operate, the general line of the party must triumph. In the big Lubyanka, it was very easily proven to the arrested individuals that they were traitors of the motherland, or to it. And they were sentenced to 10 years, and now the president of the Scientific and Technical Society of Cell 75 took heart from the thought that he hadn't made any errors. In the Butyrki cells, the arched metal frames supporting the bunks were very, very low. Even the prison administration had never thought of having prisoners sleep under them. Therefore, you first tossed your neighbor your coat so that he could spread it out for you under there, and then you lay face down in the aisle and crawled your way in. Prisoners walked through the aisle, the floor underneath the bunks was swept maybe once a month, and you could wash your hands only during the evening trip to the toilet, and even then without soap. And it was thus impossible to say that you could perceive your body as a divine vessel. But I was happy, there on the asphalt floor, under the bunks, in a dog's den, with dust and crumbs from the bunks falling in our eyes. I was absolutely happy, without any qualifications. Epicurus spoke truly. Even the absence of variety can be sensed as satisfaction when a variety of dissatisfactions has preceded it. After camp, which had already seemed endless, and after a 10-hour work-day, after cold, rain, and aching back, oh, what happiness it was to lie there for whole days on end, to sleep, and nevertheless receive 1.5 pounds of bread and 2 hot meals a day, made from cattle feed or from dolphin's flesh. In a word, the Butyr health resort. To sleep was so important, to lie there on one's belly, to cover one's back, and just to sleep. When you were asleep, you didn't spend your strength nor torment your heart, and meanwhile your sentence was passing. When our life crackles and sparks like a torch, we curse the necessity of spending 8 hours uselessly in sleep. When we have been deprived of everything, when we have been deprived of hope, then, bless you, 14 hours of sleep. But they kept me in that cell 2 months, and I slept enough to make up for the past year and the year ahead. And during that time I moved forward under the bunks to the window, and then all the way back to the latrine barrel, but on the bunks this time, and then on the bunks I moved to the archway. I was sleeping very little by this time. I was gulping down the elixir of life and enjoying myself. In the morning, the Scientific and Technical Society, then chess, books. Oh, those itinerant books. There were only 3 or 4 for 8 or 10 people, and there was always a waiting list for them. Then a 20-minute walk outdoors, a major chord. We never refused our walk, even when it was raining heavily. And the main thing was people, people, people. Nikolai Andreevich Semyonov, one of the creators of the Dnieper hydroelectric dam and power station. His POW friend, the engineer F.F. Karpov. Witty, caustic Viktor Kagan, a physicist. The musician and conservatory student Volodya Klempner, a composer. A woodcutter and hunter from the Vyatka forests, as profound as a forest lake. An Orthodox preacher from Europe, Yevgeny Ivanovich Divnich. He did not confine himself to theology, but condemned Marxism, declaring that no one in Europe had taken it seriously for a long time. And I defended it because, after all, I was a Marxist. And even a year ago I would have confidently demolished him with quotations. How disparagingly I would have mocked him. But my first year as a prisoner had left its mark inside me. And just when had that happened? I hadn't noticed. There had been so many new events, sights, meanings, that I could no longer say, they don't exist, that's a bourgeois lie. And now I had to admit, yes, they do exist. And right at that point my whole line of reasoning began to weaken, and so they could beat me in our arguments without half trying. And again the POWs kept coming and coming and coming. This was the second year of the wave of them that kept unceasingly coming from Europe. And once more there were Russian émigrés from Europe, from Manchuria. One went about among the émigrés seeking news of acquaintances by first asking what country they had come from, and did they know so-and-so. Yes, of course they did. And that is how I learned of the execution of Colonel Yasovich. And the old German, that portly German, now emaciated and ill, whom I had once upon a time, back in East Prussia, was it 200 years ago, forced to carry my suitcase. Oh, how small the world really is. Strange fate that brought us together again. The old man smiled at me. He recognized me, too, and even seemed pleased by our meeting. He had forgiven me. He had been sentenced to 10 years, but he certainly didn't have anywhere near that long to live. And there was another German there, too, lanky and young, but unresponsive, perhaps because he didn't know one word of Russian. You wouldn't even take him for a German right off the bat. The thieves had torn off everything Germany had on and given him a faded old Soviet field shirt in exchange. He was a famous German air ace. His first campaign had been in the war between Bolivia and Paraguay, his second in Spain, his third Poland, his fourth over England, his fifth Cyprus, his sixth the Soviet Union. Since he was an ace, he could certainly not have avoided shooting down women and children from the air. That made him a war criminal, and he got a prison sentence and a muzzle of 5 additional years. And, of course, there had to be one right-thinking person, like Prosecutor Kretov, in the cell. They were right to imprison all you counter-revolutionary bastards. History will grind up your bones for fertilizer. You're going to be fertilizer yourself, you dog, they shouted back. No, they will reconsider my case. I'm innocent. And the whole cell howled and seethed. And a grey-haired Russian language teacher stood up on the bunks barefoot and wrung his hands like a latter-day Jesus Christ. Children of mine, make peace with one another, my children. And they howled at him, too. Your children are in the Bryansk forests. We are nobody's children. All we are is the sons of Gulag. After dinner and the evening trip to the toilet, night cloaked the window muzzles and the nagging electric lights below the ceiling lit up. Day divided the prisoners and night drew them closer together. There were no quarrels in the evening. Lectures and concerts were given. And in this, too, Timofey Efrosovsky shone. He spent entire evenings on Italy, Denmark, Norway, Sweden. The émigrés spoke about the Balkans, about France. Someone delivered a lecture on Le Corbusier. Someone else delivered one on the habits of bees. Someone else on Gogol. This was when we smoked our lungs full. Smoke filled up the cell and hovered in the air like a fog, and there was no draught to pull it out the window because of the muzzles. Kostiakula, twin to me in age, round-faced, blue-eyed, amusingly awkward, stepped up to the table and recited to us the verses he had composed in prison. Kostiakula doesn't respond. He's disappeared. I am afraid he's not among the living. His voice broke with emotion. His verses were entitled, My First Food Parcel, To My Wife, To My Son. When in prison you strain to get by ear verses written in prison, you don't waste a single thought on whether the author's use of syllabic stress is faulty, and whether his lines end in assonances or full rhymes. These verses are the blood of your own heart, the tears of your own wife. The cell wept. In that cell I myself set out to write verses about prison, and it was there that I recited the verses of Yesenin, who had almost, but not quite, been on the forbidden list before the war. And young Bubnov, a POW, and before that apparently a student who had not completed his studies, worshipfully gazed at those reciting, his face aglow. He was not a technical specialist, and he hadn't come from camp, but he was on his way there, and because of the purity and forthrightness of his character, he would in all likelihood die there. People like him don't survive there, and for him and for others, their fatal descent braked for the moment. The evenings in Cell 75 were a sudden revelation of that beautiful world which exists and will continue to exist, but which their own hard fate hadn't given them one little year of, not even one little year of their young lives. The swill trough dropped down, and the turnkey's mug barked at us, Bed! No, even before the war, when I was studying at 2 higher educational institutions at the same time, and earning my way by tutoring, and striving to write too. Even then I had not experienced such full, such heart-rending, such completely filled days as I did in Cell 75 that summer. But listen, I said to Sarapkin, I've heard since then from someone called Diel, a 16-year-old boy who got a $5, not on a school report card, for anti-Soviet propaganda. What, do you know him too? He was on our prisoner transport to Karaganda. I heard, I continued, that you were given work as a laboratory assistant doing medical analyses, and that Timofeyev Rasovsky was constantly being sent out on general assignment work. Yes, and he grew very weak. He was half dead when they brought him from the Stolypin car here to the Butyrki, and he is in a hospital bed here right now, and the 4th Special Department is issuing him cream and even wine, but it's hard to say whether he will ever get back on his feet again. The task of the 4th Special Department of the MVD was to solve scientific problems using prisoners. Did the 4th Special Department summon you? Yes, they asked us whether we considered it might still be possible after 6 months of Karaganda to start setting up our institute here, in the fatherland. And you, of course, agreed enthusiastically. Most certainly. After all, we have come to understand our mistakes. And besides, all the equipment wrenched from its original place and put into packing cases got here even without us. What dedication to science on the part of the MVD. May I ask for a little more Schubert? And Sarapkin sang softly, staring sadly at the window, his spectacles reflecting both their dark muzzles and their light upper sections. Vom Abendrot zum Morgenlicht ward mancher Kopf zum Kreise. Wer glaubt es, meiner war des nicht auf dieser ganzen Reise. Tolstoy's dream has come true. Prisoners are no longer compelled to attend pernicious religious services. The prison churches have been shut down. True, their buildings remain, but they have been successfully adapted to enlarge the prisons themselves. 2,000 additional prisoners have thereby been housed in the Butyrki church, and in the course of a year, estimating an average turnover of 2 weeks, another 50,000 will pass through the cells in what was once the church. On arriving at the Butyrki for the 4th or 5th time, hurrying confidently to my assigned cell, through the courtyard surrounded by prison buildings, and even outstripping the jailer by a shoulder, like a horse that hurries without the urging of whip or reins, home to where the oats are waiting, I sometimes even forgot to glance at the square church rising into an octagon. It stood apart in the middle of the courtyard quadrangle. Its muzzles were not machine-made of glass reinforced with iron rods as they were in the main section of the prison. They were rotten, unplaned, grey boards, pure and simple, and they indicated the building's second-rank priority. What they maintained there was a kind of intra-Butyrki transit prison, so to speak, for recently sentenced prisoners. And at one time, in 1945, I had experienced it as a big, important step, when they led us into the church after our OSO sentencing. And that was the right time to do it, too. It was a good time for prayer. Took us up to the second floor, and the third floor was also partitioned off, and from the octagonal vestibule distributed us among different cells. Mine was the southeast cell. This was a large square cell in which at the time 200 prisoners were confined. They were sleeping, as they did everywhere else there, on the bunks, and they were one-story bunks, under the bunks, and just simply on the tile floor out in the aisles. Not only were the muzzles on the windows second-rate, everything else, too, was in a style appropriate not to true sons of Butyrki, but to its stepsons. No books, no chess sets, no checkers were distributed to this swarming mass, and the dented aluminum bowls and beat-up wooden spoons were collected and removed from one mealtime to another, for fear that in the rush they might get carried off on prisoner transports. They were even stingy with mugs for the stepsons. They washed the bowls after the gruel, and then the prisoners had to lap up their tea slops out of them. The absence of one's own dishes was particularly acute for those who experienced the mixed blessing of receiving a parcel from their families. Despite their meager means, relatives made a special effort to provide parcels in those last days before the prisoner transports left. The families had had no prison education themselves, and they never got any good advice in the prison reception office either, and therefore they didn't send plastic dishes, the one and only kind prisoners were allowed to have, but glass or metal ones instead. All these honeys, jams, condensed milks were pitilessly poured and scraped out of their cans through the swill trough in the cell door into whatever the prisoner had, and in the church cells he had nothing at all, which meant that he simply got it in the palms of his hands, in his mouth, in his handkerchief, the flaps of his coat, which was quite normal in Gulag terms, but not in the center of Moscow. And at the same time the jailer kept hurrying him as if he were late for his train. The jailer hurried him because he was counting on licking out whatever was left in the jars. Everything was temporary in the church cells, without that illusion of permanency which existed in the interrogation cells and in the cells where prisoners awaited sentencing. Ground meat, a semi-processed product partially prepared for Gulag. The prisoners were unavoidably here those few days until a bit of space had been cleared for them at Krasnaya Presnya. They had just one special privilege here. 3 times a day they were allowed to go for their gruel themselves. No grits were given out here, but the gruel was served 3 times a day, and this was a merciful thing because it was more frequent, hotter, and stuck to the ribs better. This special privilege was allowed here because there were no elevators in the church, as there were in the rest of the prison, and the jailers had no wish to exert themselves. The big, heavy kettles had to be carried from a long way off, across the yard, and then up a steep flight of stairs. It was hard work, and the prisoners had very little strength for it, but they went willingly, just to get out into the green yard one more time and hear the birds singing. The church cells had their own air. It held a fluttering presentiment of the draughts of future transit prisons, of the winds of the Arctic camps. In the church cells you celebrated the ritual of getting adjusted to the fact that your sentence had been handed down and that it wasn't in the least a joke, to the fact that no matter how cruel the new era of your life might be, your mind must nevertheless digest and accept it. And you arrived at that with great difficulty. And you had no permanent cellmates here as you did in the interrogation cells, which made the latter something like a family. Day and night people were brought in and taken away, singly and by tens, and as a result the prisoners kept moving ahead along the floor and along the bunks, and it was rare to lie next to any one neighbor for more than 2 nights. Once you met an interesting person there, you had to question him immediately, because otherwise you would miss out for good and all. And that is how I missed out on the automobile mechanic, Medvedev. When I began to talk to him, I remembered that his name had been mentioned by the Emperor Mikhail. Yes, he had indeed been implicated in the same case as Mikhail, because he had been one of the first to read the Manifesto to the Russian people, and had failed to write a denunciation. Medvedev had been given an unforgivably, shamefully light sentence, 3 years. And under Article 58, too, for which even 5 years was considered a juvenile sentence. They had evidently decided the Emperor was really insane, and had been easy on the rest of them because of class considerations. But I had hardly pulled myself together to ask how Medvedev regarded all this, than they took him off with his things. Certain circumstances led us to conclude that he had been taken off to be released, and this confirmed those first rumors of the Stalinist amnesty which reached our ears that summer. The amnesty for no one, an amnesty after which everything was just as crowded as before, even under the bunks. They took my neighbor, an elderly Schutzbündler, off to a prisoner transport. Here, in the land of the world proletariat, all those Schutzbündlers who had been suffocating in conservative Austria had been roasted with tenors, and on the islands of the archipelago they met their end. And there was a swarthy little fellow with coal-black hair and feminine-looking eyes like dark cherries, but with a broad, larger-than-usual nose that spoiled his whole face, turning it into a caricature. For a day he and I lay next to each other in silence, and on the second day he found occasion to ask me, "What do you think I am?" He spoke Russian correctly and fluently, but with an accent. I hesitated. There seemed to be something of Transcaucasia in him, Armenian, presumably. He smiled. "I used to pass myself off very easily as a Georgian. My name was Yasha. Everyone laughed at me. I collected trade union dues." I looked him over. His was truly a comical figure, a half-pint, his face out of proportion, asymmetrical, his smile amiable. And then suddenly he tensed up, his features sharpened, his eyes narrowed, and cut me like the stroke of a black saber. "I am an intelligence officer of the Romanian General Staff, Lieutenant Vladimirescu." I started. This was real dynamite. I had met a couple of 100 fabricated spies, and I never thought I might meet up with a real one. I thought they didn't exist. According to his story, he was of an aristocratic family. From the age of 3, he had been destined to serve on the general staff. At 6, he had entered the intelligence service school. Growing up, he had picked his own field of future activity, the Soviet Union, taking into account that here in Russia the most relentless counterintelligence service in the world existed, and that it was particularly difficult to work here because everyone suspected everyone else. And, he now concluded, he had worked here not at all badly. He had spent several pre-war years in Nikolaev, and it appears had arranged for the Romanian armies to capture a shipyard intact. Subsequently, he had been at the Stalingrad tractor factory, and after that at the Urals heavy machinery factory. In the course of collecting trade union dues, he had entered the office of the chief of a major division of the plant, had shut the door behind him, and his idiotic smile had promptly left his face, and that saber-sharp cutting expression had appeared. Ponomariev! And Ponomariev was using an altogether different name at the Urals heavy machinery factory. "We have been keeping track of you from Stalingrad on. You left your job there." He had been some kind of bigwig at the Stalingrad tractor factory. "And you have set yourself up here under an assumed name. You can choose to be shot by your own people or to work with us." Ponomariev chose to work with them, and that indeed was very much in the style of those super-successful pigs. The lieutenant supervised his work until he himself was transferred to the jurisdiction of the German intelligence officer resident in Moscow, who sent him to Podolsk to work at his specialty. As Vladimirescu explained to me, intelligence officers and saboteurs are given an all-round training, but each of them has his own narrow area of specialization. And Vladimirescu's special field was cutting the main cord of a parachute on the inside. In Podolsk, he was met at the parachute warehouse by the chief of the warehouse guard. Who was it? What kind of person was he? Who at night led Vladimirescu into the warehouse for 8 hours, climbing up to the piles of parachutes on his ladder and managing not to disturb the piles. Vladimirescu pulled out the braided main support cord and with special scissors cut 4/5 of the way through it, leaving 1/5 intact, so that it would break in the air. Vladimirescu had studied many long years in preparation for this one night, and now, working feverishly, in the course of 8 hours he ruined, according to his account, upwards of 2,000 parachutes. 15 seconds per parachute. "I destroyed a whole Soviet parachute division." His cherry-like eyes sparkled with malice. When he was arrested, he refused to give any testimony for 8 whole months. Imprisoned in the Butyrki, he uttered not one word. "And didn't they torture you?" "No." His lips twitched as though to indicate he didn't even consider such a thing possible in the case of a non-Soviet citizen. "Beat your own people so foreigners will be more afraid of you. But a real spy's a gold mine. After all, we may have to use him for an exchange." The day came when they showed him the newspapers. Romania had capitulated. "Come on now, testify." He continued to keep silent. The newspapers could have been forgeries. They showed him an order of the Romanian General Staff. Under the conditions of the armistice, the General Staff ordered all its intelligence agents to cease operations and surrender. He continued to keep silent. The order could have been a forgery. Finally, he was confronted with his immediate superior on the General Staff, who ordered him to disclose his information and surrender. At this point, Vladimirescu cold-bloodedly gave his testimony, and now, in the slow passing of the sale day, it was no longer of any importance, and he told me some of it, too. They had not even tried him. They had not even given him a sentence. After all, he wasn't one of our own. "I am a career man, and will remain one until I die, and they won't waste me." "But you are revealing yourself to me," I pointed out. "I might very well remember your face. Just imagine our meeting some day in public." "If I am convinced that you haven't recognized me, you will remain alive. If you recognize me, I will kill you or else force you to work for us." He had not the slightest desire to spoil his relationship with his cell neighbor. He said this very simply, with total conviction. I was really convinced that he wouldn't hesitate for a moment to gun someone down or cut their throat. In this whole long prisoner's chronicle, we will not again meet such a hero. It was the only encounter of the sort I ever had in my 11 years of prison, camp, and exile, and others didn't even have one. And our mass circulation comics try to dupe young people into believing that these are the only people the organs catch. It was enough to look around that church cell to grasp that it was youth itself the organs were catching in the first place. The war had ended, and we could allow ourselves the luxury of arresting everyone who had been singled out. They were no longer needed as soldiers. They said that in 1944 and 1945, a so-called Democratic Party had passed through the cells of the small Moscow province, Lubyanka. According to rumor, it had consisted of 100 boys, had its own statutes and its own membership cards. The eldest of them was a pupil in the 10th grade of a Moscow school, and he was its general secretary. Students were also glimpsed fleetingly in the prisons during the last year of the war. I met some here and there. I was presumably not old myself, but they at any rate were younger. How imperceptibly all that crept up on us, while we, I, my co-defendant, and others of our age, had been fighting for 4 years at the front. A whole new generation had grown up here in the rear, and had it been very long since we ourselves had tramped the parquet floors of the university corridors, considering ourselves the youngest and most intelligent in the whole country, and, for that matter, on earth. And then suddenly pale youths crossed the tile floors of the prison cells to approach us haughtily, and we learned with astonishment that we were no longer the youngest and most intelligent. They were. But I didn't take offense at this. At that point I was already happy to move over a bit to make room. I knew so very well their passion for arguing with everyone, for finding out everything. I understood their pride in having chosen a worthy lot, and in not regretting it. It gave me goose-flesh to hear the rustle of the prison halos hovering over those self-enamored and intelligent little faces. 1 month earlier, in another Butyrki cell, a semi-hospital cell, I had just stepped into the aisle, and had still not seen any empty place for myself, when approaching in a way that hinted at a verbal dispute, even at an entreaty to enter into one, came a pale, yellowish youth with a Jewish tenderness of face, wrapped, despite the summer, in a threadbare soldier's overcoat shot full of holes. He was chilled. His name was Boris Gamarov. He began to question me. The conversation rolled along, on one hand our biographies, on the other politics. I don't remember why, but I recalled one of the prayers of the late President Roosevelt, which had been published in our newspapers, and I expressed what seemed to me a self-evident evaluation of it. "Well, that's hypocrisy, of course." And suddenly the young man's yellowish brows trembled, his pale lips pursed. He seemed to draw himself up, and he asked me, "Why? Why do you not admit the possibility that a political leader might sincerely believe in God?" And that is all that was said. But what a direction the attack had come from! To hear such words from someone born in 1923? I could have replied to him very firmly, but prison had already undermined my certainty, and the principal thing was that some kind of clean, pure feeling does live within us, existing apart from all our convictions. And right then it dawned upon me that I had not spoken out of conviction, but because the idea had been implanted in me from outside. And because of this I was unable to reply to him, and I merely asked him, "Do you believe in God?" "Of course," he answered tranquilly. "Of course?" "Of course. Yes. Yes. The Komsomols were flying ahead of the flock, everywhere, but so far only the NKGB had noticed." Notwithstanding his youth, Boris Gamarov had not only fought as a sergeant in an anti-tank unit with those anti-tank 45s the soldiers had christened Farewell Motherland. He had also been wounded in the lungs, and the wound had not yet healed, and because of this TB had set in. Gamarov was given a medical discharge from the army and enrolled in the biology department of Moscow University. And thus two strands intertwined in him, one from his life as a soldier, and the other from the by no means foolish and by no means dead student's life at war's end. A circle formed of those who thought and reasoned about the future, even though no one had given them any instructions to do so. And the experienced eye of the organs singled out three of them and pulled them in. In 1937, Gamarov's father had been killed in prison or shot, and his son was hurrying along the same path. During the interrogation, he had read several of his own verses to the interrogator with feeling. And I deeply regret that I have not managed to remember even one of them, and there is nowhere to seek them out today. Otherwise, I would have cited them here. For a number of months after that, my path crossed those of all three co-defendants. Right there in a Butyrki cell, I met Vyacheslav D., and there is always someone like him when young people are arrested. He had taken an iron stand within the group, but he quickly broke down under interrogation. He got less than any of the others, 5 years, and it looked as though he was secretly counting a good deal on his influential papa to get him out. And then, in the Butyrki church, I encountered Georgy Ingal, the eldest of the three. Despite his youth, he was already a candidate member of the Union of Soviet Writers. He had a very bold pen. His style was one of strong contrasts. If he had been willing to make his peace politically, vivid and untrodden literary paths would have opened up before him. He had already nearly finished a novel about Debussy, but his early success had not emasculated him, and at the funeral of his teacher, Yuri Tanyanov, he had made a speech declaring that Tanyanov had been persecuted, and by this means had assured himself of an 8-year term. And right then Gamarov caught up with us, and while waiting to go to Krasnaya Presnya, I had to face up to their united point of view. This confrontation was not easy for me. At the time, I was committed to that world outlook which is incapable of admitting any new fact or evaluating any new opinion before a label has been found for it from the already available stock, be it the hesitant duplicity of the petty bourgeoisie or the militant nihilism of the déclassé intelligentsia. I don't recall that Ingal and Gamarov attacked Marx in my presence, but I do remember how they attacked Lev Tolstoy, and from what direction the attack was launched. Tolstoy rejected the Church, but he failed to take into account its mystical and its organizing role. He rejected the teachings of the Bible, but for the most part modern science was not in conflict with the Bible, not even with its opening lines about the creation of the world. He rejected the state, but without the state there would be chaos. He preached the combining of mental and physical work in one individual's life, but that was a senseless leveling of capabilities and talents. And finally, as we see from Stalin's violence, an historical personage can be omnipotent, yet Tolstoy scoffed at the very idea. In my pre-prison and prison years, I too had long ago come to the conclusion that Stalin had set the course of the Soviet state in a fateful direction. But then Stalin died quietly, and did the ship of state change course very noticeably? The personal, individual imprint he left on events consisted of dismal stupidity, petty tyranny, self-glorification. And in all the rest he followed the beaten path exactly as it had been signposted, step by step. The boys read me their own verses and demanded mine in exchange, and I as yet had none. They read Pasternak particularly, whom they praised to the skies. I had once read My Sister Life, and hadn't liked it, considering it precious, abstruse, and very, very far from ordinary human paths. But they recited to me Lieutenant Schmidt's last speech at his trial, and it touched me deeply because it applied so to us. For 30 years I have nurtured my love for my native land, and I shall neither expect nor miss your leniency. Gamarov and Exile were just as shiningly attuned as that. We do not need your leniency. We are not languishing from imprisonment. We are proud of it. But who is really capable of not languishing? After a few months, Exile's young wife renounced and abandoned him. Gamarov, because of his revolutionary inclinations, did not even have a sweetheart yet. Was it not here, in these prison cells, that the great truth dawned? The cell was constricted, but wasn't freedom even more constricted? Was it not our own people, tormented and deceived, that lay beside us there under the bunks and in the aisles? Not to arise with my whole land would have been harder still, and for the path that I have trod, I have no qualms at all. The young people imprisoned in these cells under the political articles of the Code were never the average young people of the nation, but were always separated from them by a wide gap. In those years, most of our young people still faced a future of disintegrating, of becoming disillusioned, indifferent, falling in love with an easy life, and then, perhaps, beginning all over again the bitter climb from that cozy little valley up to a new peak, possibly after another 20 years. But the young prisoners of 1945, sentenced under 5810, had leapt that whole future chasm of indifference in one jump, and bore their heads boldly erect under the axe. In the Butyrki church, the Moscow students, already sentenced, cut off and estranged from everything, wrote a song, and before twilight sang it in their uncertain voices. 3 times a day we go for gruel, the evenings we pass in song. With a contraband prison needle, we sew ourselves bags for the road. We don't care about ourselves any more. We signed, just to be quicker. And when will we ever return here again from the distant Siberian camps? Good Lord, how could we have missed the main point of the whole thing, while we had been ploughing through the mud out there on the bridgeheads, while we had been cowering in shell holes and pushing binocular periscopes above the bushes? Back home, a new generation had grown up and gotten moving. But hadn't it started moving in another direction? In a direction we wouldn't have been able and wouldn't have dared to move in. They weren't brought up the way we were. Our generation would return, having turned in its weapons, jingling its heroes' medals, proudly telling its combat stories. And our younger brothers would only look at us contemptuously. Oh, you stupid dolts. End of Part 2. This concludes the reading of Volume 1 of the Gulag Archipelago. This book was read by Frederick Davidson. If you would like to receive a free catalog listing our complete line of audiobooks, Write us at Post Box 969, Ashland, Oregon, zip code 97520. Or call toll-free 1-800-SAY-BOOK. That's 1-800-729-2665. Will you please wind or rewind the tape as appropriate, so as to present the book in order for the next person to enjoy? Thank you. The Gulag Archipelago, 1918 to 1956. An experiment in literary investigation by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. Translated by Thomas P. Whitney. Copyright 1973 by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. English language translation, copyright 1973-1974 by Harper & Row Publishers, Incorporated. This recording of the reading of the Gulag Archipelago was published by arrangement with Harper & Row Publishers, Incorporated, and was produced in 1989 by Blackstone Audio Books, which holds the copyright thereto. Neither this recording nor any part thereof may be reproduced or used for any purpose without prior written authority from Blackstone Audio Books, Incorporated. The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 2. This volume is 672 pages long and contains two parts. The Destructive Labor Camps, which consists of 22 chapters, and The Soul and Barbed Wire, which consists of 4 chapters. The volume will be read in 2 sections. The first will take us through Chapter 9 of the Destructive Labor Camps. The second will pick up with Chapter 10 and take us to the end of Volume 2. And now, the Gulag Archipelago, Volume 2. The Destructive Labor Camps. The author makes the following note to preface Chapter 1. There is no limit to what should be included in this part. To attain and encompass its savage meaning, one would have to drag out many lives in the camps, the very same in which one cannot survive for even one term, without some special advantage, because they were invented for destruction. And from this it follows that all those who drank of this most deeply, who explored it most fully, are already in their graves and cannot tell us. No one now can ever tell us the most important thing about these camps. And the whole scope of this story and of this truth is beyond the capabilities of one lonely pen. All I had was a peephole into the archipelago, not the view from a tower. But fortunately several other books have emerged, and more will emerge. In the Kolyma stories of Shalamov, the reader will perhaps feel more truly and surely the pitilessness of the spirit of the archipelago and the limits of human despair. To taste the sea, all one needs is one gulp. Chapter 1. The Fingers of Aurora. Rosy-fingered Heos, so often mentioned in Homer and called Aurora by the Romans, caressed, too, with those fingers the first early morning of the archipelago. When our compatriots heard via the BBC that M. Mikhailov claimed to have discovered that concentration camps had existed in our country as far back as 1921, many of us, and many in the West, too, were astonished. That early, really? Even in 1921? Of course not. Of course Mikhailov was in error. In 1921, in fact, concentration camps were already in full flower, already even coming to an end. It would be far more accurate to say that the archipelago was born with the shots of the cruiser Aurora. And how could it have been otherwise? Let us pause to ponder. Didn't Marx and Engels teach that the old bourgeois machinery of compulsion had to be broken up, and a new one created immediately in its place? And included in the machinery of compulsion were the army — we are not surprised that the Red Army was created at the beginning of 1918 — the police,